as a creator, I want to create these types of experiences and I can't. Okay, how do I make the tools that let me do that? I think at the end of the day, everything is story. That's what appeals to people. That's what keeps people coming back.
Hey guys, welcome. I'm excited today. We have with us Rachel Joy Victor on the Creative Block. Rachel is co-founder of Fabric, a designer, strategist, and world builder who works at the crossroads of emerging technologies and mediums, including XR, AR, and Web3. She has expertise in creating multi-platform narratives and immersive experiences to designing tools, platforms, spaces, even cities. Rachel's clients lists includes Disney, HBO, Vans, Ford, Nike, short list, many others. She has an academic background in computational neuroscience, spatial economics, and data analysis. And you're going to have to explain what that means to me. She shares her insights and findings through workshops, talks, and written deliverables. We met at USC School of Cinematic Arts, the Artificial Intelligence and Future of Creative Work, where you were honored panelist. I was really inspired by your talk and, had to approach you and ask you to be on the show. So I really appreciate today you making the time to be on.
Vince, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about our conversation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. How was that panel for you? Like, I was thinking about how you seem to be really out there on panels in the press and things like that. How important is that for you as you get your own brand out, as you get the understanding of the technology out? Is that very intentional for you?
Yeah, 100%. When there was a lot of conversation around the metaverse and NFTs, and obviously not to say that there isn't good work happening in that space now, but the attention span is very hype cycle based in general, right? But at the time I was doing a lot of like executive education in the space, because obviously there's always, when there's a new technology, that one layer of like everyone getting excited about things, talking at a really high level, but not diving down into the specifics and understanding, okay, how do we actually build these things? What are the implications? What are the monetization strategies? How does it actually reach people? So I was doing a lot of like executive education around that wave. And then as AI was happening, obviously I have a background in AI and have like worked in the space for a while, but really felt like this isn't just something that companies should be thinking about. This is something that, the public in general, the industry at large, outside of the executive, suite should be thinking about. And so I think from an educational perspective, that's why I feel really passionate about participating in all these panels. I think people need to understand the technology at a deeper level, because then they know what they can advocate for and they can know what to push for or what's most important or how the technology can actually develop and how they're going to be a part of it. Yes, I think all these events are such a big part of making that happen.
I appreciate you doing that because it's been a huge part of my education. You know what I mean? It's like I pulled a thread initially on Web3, imagining my own IP and where it could potentially live in this space. But really, my education gear shift when I started getting in front of people and going to panels, beyond that. So I'm very grateful that you think that way, because it's from this point of view, it's very valuable. So I'm very, very grateful. So in your bio, you say you work in the intersection of emerging tech and experience and story. For the general audience, tell us about what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah. So I think I've had a very kind of roundabout and interesting career path, which I think if anyone's doing anything with emerging tech and experience, that's kind of the story. Everyone finds their own way into it. For me, when I think about experience and emerging tech, it's really important to think about how do we design this and what are all the pieces that fit into the design? I think design sometimes is thought of as its own vertical. The way I think about design and all of these other pieces are that they're a horizontal layer and that you have to make these decisions across an organization. So I had started my career doing a lot of work in narrative design and world building, really thinking about, okay, what is the way a story is told when I'm not just a sole author, but the audience is co-authoring with me. And as a piece of that, what is, the rules of the world? How is the world coming across to the participant? And how does that look different if the world is a virtual reality world, or if it's an augmented reality world, or if it's a world that's this multi-platform narrative that you have part of it on your phone and part of it in your browser and part of it in like a live location or live event. That was kind of how I started, was focusing on that narrative piece. And then I started to realize like all of the choices that we're making at a narrative level are really influenced by the business model. The choices we make about which platforms to tell the story in, the choices we make about what is valuable and what the end user is ultimately paying for, right? Especially with emerging tech, sometimes it's like, am I paying for the experience? Am I paying with my eyeballs as through advertisement or whatever? Is it a subscription? All of those decisions really have a ripple effect on the types of story that are being told. So that's how I started getting to the strategy side of things of, okay, how did these pieces start to connect? What is the business model? How are we measuring fan engagement or user engagement in general? How do we think about business model across formats and franchise development and all of that? And then, started to see more pieces of like, oh, wait, what are the other things that are impacting story? The product is impacting story, the UX, right? All these choices we make about how the person gets into the experience are also fundamentally part of how they feel about the narrative experience. Or if we want this experience, especially when we talk about like VR, when we talk about the metaverse or NFTs, we want it to be responsive, right? We want it to be not a one size fits all. We want to know me as a person. We want to remember who I am, all of those kind of things. That requires data behind it, right? We need to have the data about the user, and then we need to have data and flexibility enough on the world side to respond, whether it's the characters responding or the quest logic responding to the user in some way. And so my work started including more of thinking about those production constraints and the data systems architecture and all of that. So I think over time, there's been more things kind of added on to how I think about experience design and storytelling and emerging technology. But I think all of them at the end of the day come back to, it comes back to experience. It comes back to all of these things impact the ultimate experience. And the more we're moving into emerging tech, the more we should be having these kind of cross vertical conversations internally. So that's what a lot of my work ends up focusing on nowadays is, yeah, let's think about the story, but let's also get everyone on board and being aligned in what they're working towards.
I love that. I tell the story all the time. When I first started doing this, I called this Conversations with Artists and Creatives Working in Web3. And then soon I figured out that was too narrow, and there's too many other things happening that are overlapping. And, you're a great example of that, where you touch on all things, so it opened the world for me. I was having coffee with my wife this morning, and, I have this running joke. If I want to piss her off, I'll start explaining what Web3 is. And she was asking me, so who is this person you're talking to and what does she do? And I read the little intro, and she was like, oh, so if I wanted to have a meditation session with the Buddha and walk through a forest, she could maybe design that, right? And I'm like, well, that's could possibly happen, at some point, you know what I mean? So, yeah, it's interesting to see how what you're building, what brands want, and then what consumers are going to lean into is also another factor. I imagine you think about that as well.
For sure. I think it's interesting because I think the nature of what it means to be a creative, to your point, has evolved so much. With film and TV, there's a very specific idea of what a creator and creative means. You come in with your idea, you have a very specific story you want to tell, and you have a vision of how you want to tell that story, and then you're executing on it. Being a creative now with all these emerging mediums looks very different because you have to be flexible in terms of, okay, I have a general idea of what this concept is. Maybe it's this story that's appealing to me. Maybe it's a mechanic that's appealing to me. And that's kind of my driving force. But everything else around it is maybe a little bit flexible. I come in thinking it's going to be our VR experience. And then a brand partner comes and says, we love it, but we want it to be AR when we're having a festival that we're sponsoring. And you're like, okay, great. I can take the germ of it and pivot it in this way. Being a creator is much more having your vision and holding to it, but also having the flexibility of a designer to be like, okay, these are the pieces I have. How am I going to fit them together now? Given what I know of what's possible and the constraints I'm being given.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's really exciting. And tell us about what Fabric is and what it does.
Yeah. So coming out of, a lot of these conversations, I mentioned I worked in narrative design and world building for a while. I did strategy. I led design and strategy for a brand innovation studio where we worked with a number of consumer brands on helping them through emerging tech and thinking through it both on a product level and on a marketing level. So there was obviously a lot of metaverse, a lot of NFT conversations, but was seeing this gap on the tooling side of brands want to build these types of experiences, creators want to create these new categories of experiences, but the barrier to entry is really high. A lot of these projects are building infrastructure from scratch for singular projects, which really drives up costs. So if you're trying to be an independent creator, or you're a brand and you're just doing a one-off experience, you're building this architecture and all of it just goes towards this one thing and then kind of dies because it's a unique format. So we're seeing all of those challenges, and then obviously have included AI in my work throughout my career and had studied AI, and was seeing that where it was going in general, both across generative AI and across other parts of AI, was really accelerating. And I was like, okay, great. I want to be on the tooling side for a couple of years. I want to make sure we're developing the types of tools that can help us build these categories of experiences, and that I can shape the tools in a way that, you know, accounts for the needs I've seen. So Fabric is me, my co-founder, Todd Terrazas, who was the founder and executive director of AI LA, which is like a, I think at this point, 16,000 person member community in
neat. Very cool.
LA, all focused around like AI education and building community around AI. And then our other co-founders, Eric Wilker, who comes from the studio side of things, spent like 16 plus years at Warner Brothers, helping them think through innovation and how it affects the creative, and also at Amazon, a number of other companies. So we kind of each had a little different pieces of what we were bringing to it, right? I was coming from the design and tech side, Eric coming from the business side, Todd coming from the community side. And we were like, how do we support this next generation of tools? How do we make sure it's supporting creators? How do we make sure it's supporting founders and plugging into the ecosystem? So right now as Fabric, we have like 3 things we do. One is we have events and educational kind of programming we do. There's AI on the Lot, which is kind of a tentpole event. We did our second year a couple months back of that, which is, you know, just purely educational for people on where do AI tools fit in? How do you actually operationalize it? What are the challenges? We have startups we work really closely with that are developing these tools, and like I'm supporting them on product. We're supporting them on positioning, on helping them scale by understanding what the needs of creators actually are. And then on the studio side, we're technical advisors and consultants as they start to think about where AI tools fit in, and helping them think in a really smart way about like the ethical side of it, the technical side of it, and how it fits into building these new pipelines.
I love it. And I'm glad you mentioned ethics, because that's been fortunately, I've been seeing that as a really ongoing conversation with builders, not just, you know, the public having this concern about the evils of AI. If we think about this as a marathon, now's the time to be thinking about it and be doing something about it, because everybody recognizes the bias that's written in. I mean, we're sometimes not great humans. We don't always make great tech. So from, you know, sort of being in the audiences, I really have been appreciating that conversation and people really putting a lot of importance on it, which is really refreshing.
Yeah. And that's why I think like even with events at like the USC event, there's obviously like fear around this as a topic, which I get. And I think that that's where the education piece comes in of AI has been around for a long time. A lot of tools are already using AI in different ways, right? There's just so many categories of AI. So to know what to advocate for, to know which things we push back on versus which things we're like, no, this is actually a good thing. This makes us not want to like pull our hair out during rotoscoping or whatever. We need to understand more about the technology. We need to bring that knowledge in general through the space. And then the more people that have that knowledge, we're at an early enough place, I feel like, where we can start to shape it and start to have a voice in how it develops.
Let's talk about the brands that you work with a little bit, because when I first sort of looked at, you know, your bio and your website, you know, Nike and Vans, I mean, these are lifestyle brands that even without knowing the details, it kind of makes sense. And then I saw Renault. And Renault, when I think of Renault, I don't think of, you know, anything Web3 or anything. But when you were dealing with a brand like that, what was that like, and what did they bring to the table? What was sort of their expectation?
So with a company like Renault or some of the other car companies that I've worked with, some of it is a marketing kind of focus of we want to start appealing to our consumers. We want to see, you know, do a marketing campaign. Maybe the marketing campaign involves NFTs. But I think a bigger piece of how they're thinking about emerging technology is kind of this hybrid between marketing and product, right? Especially with automotive, there are these new categories of experiences that are emerging that aren't like narrative experiences, but they're not also purely functional experiences. And I always think of like experience as kind of this gradient. You have like things where you sit down and watch a movie and you're like, yeah, this is totally a narrative experience. And then you have things like I am, using maps on my phone to find where I'm going. And that's still an experience, but it's very functional. Some of these experiences, when we're talking to brands, kind of fall in the middle of where they're trying to go as a product is used to be fully functional. And now they're realizing, because the consumer doesn't want that one size fits all moment, because vehicles are becoming semi-autonomous, and now we're thinking about what the in-car experience looks like. Or transportation isn't the only thing we offer. It's really mobility. We offer people the ability to get places. So we need to understand more about their lifestyle and where the vehicle fits into their lifestyle. There's this interesting kind of continuum of where they're trying to design for, where it's not solely a product thing. It becomes much more experiential. So as an example, some of the touch points for a vehicle could be, oh, I want like maybe a digital twin version of my vehicle that I can quickly check to make sure I know what maintenance looks like and what I need to do next to kind of upkeep the vehicle. Or it could be, I want to sync my vehicle, getting my vehicle like turned on and ready and like cooled down or heated up in time with my calendar of like, oh, I need to be at this meeting by 3 p.m. It takes me an hour and a half to get there. I don't want right now it's really sunny and warm in California. I don't want, the vehicle when I step into it to be super hot and like make my makeup all streaky or whatever. How does it know that already and start cooling down my car right before I step into it? Or those are things that are functional, but are functional taking into account lifestyle. And so start moving into that piece. So I think those are kind of categories of experiences working with some of these brands where they're trying to account more for that element. And that's where that emerging tech becomes part of how they're thinking about how they're supporting their consumers with where their life is going.
That's amazing. I could imagine too, in the next 3 to 8 years, consumers getting a taste of this and then suddenly asking for more.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like their expectation of product will by default have the expectation of experience as we go forward.
Yes. And I think we see that continuing to grow. Like, I think there is one category of like people are kind of sometimes scared of the amount of data that's being collected about them. And I do think we need more like better data policies around how the data is being utilized. But at the same time, that data is what enables customization, right? That data is why when I go on Google Maps and I was like looking up a restaurant my friend recommended, I was like, I really don't think I've been here. I don't remember it. And then Google Maps was like, sure enough, you've been here 2 years ago, right? Like it's a little creepy, but I'm like, oh, wait, now I do remember I was here, right? Like those little moments that start being a part of your life that give you maybe that serendipity that you want of, now that I have this, I'm like, wait, could this go a step further? Could it be like, oh, I'm meeting this person at 3 and then I have another meeting at 6, but there's time in between and it knows my preferences and it tells me things that are within a walkable distance that I can do in the downtime, right? Like the more that I think we start to see how this amount of data and supported by intelligent systems enabled by AI through systems designed by people that understand, how to interpret that information, I think the more we lean into that, we're going to want more of it because it's just convenient. It helps us live our lives in a more fluid way.
So how do we make it functional and not creepy? You know what I mean? Because people do want the convenience. There's just always fear that, they don't have control of their own data. They don't own it. They don't know what's going on with it. That's kind of an ongoing thing. Has there been, with the brands that you've worked with, has there been any notable experiences like sort of, somebody coming forward and say, hey, we'd like to create this, and kind of an unexpected way that sort of pulled a thread for you that you were able to develop on?
That's a good question. I think as a project, not a brand project, but as a project, I really appreciated working on the Dubai World Expo project, where I was brought on to kind of do world building for them. So the Dubai World Expo, obviously like a 6 to 9 month, 6 month long, in person expo that shows the best technology and the
Wow.
culture from around the world. And they were building this augmented reality layer over it of wanting to do virtual characters you could meet and talk to, quests you can go on as you move through the space, recommendations and things like that. So I think that project was really interesting. It kind of led me more into eventually doing spatial economics, because I think that's where I was like, my undergrad was in neuroscience. And so I was really focused on how do we understand data about the individual? How do we interpret that? How do we think about that piece? But I think the corollary to that is we know about the individual. We also need to know about context, because the context shapes how we interpret that information about the individual. And so the spatial economics piece was with an eye towards where technology is going. Like you're saying, people will want more experiences in the future. As we think about where spatial computing is going, where edge computing is going, there's a desire for more of that responsiveness and contextual in the moment kind of feedback. That feedback needs to account not just for how we're feeling and our heart rate and whatever our like neural signals are, but also, okay, what is causing that within the environment? So I think in general, working with brands is always super fun and also has its own challenges of seeing what did they value and how is that shaping what they want out of this project, right? Because I think a lot of brands, especially around the metaverse and around NFTs, came in with having a pretty expansive view of what it could be. And yes, I could walk them through like, this is what we could do for you, of like, you have a really integrated plan of your experience for consumers that has continuity across the browser and mobile experience, and when they're in your in-person event or store versus when they're online. And we can pitch that to them. But then if we go down to like, okay, how do we actually build that? Who do we need to get buy-in from? There are a lot of roadblocks, right? Around one, if I'm building something like that, who's paying for it? Which department's paying for it? It's not like a marketing budget. It's something that's infrastructural that lives across ideally multiple quarters or multiple product releases. But then if the marketing person is trying to push for it, they're not necessarily getting rewarded for it because their KPIs are being measured quarterly. And so they're not necessarily incentivized to do it. And then on the product side, if we start thinking about this integrated vision, then there's this interplay between maybe the digital assets that a player collects and the product that they actually purchase in the store, right? But that means that it starts affecting product. And then product has to think about, how do I want the virtual version of my clothing to look? Do I want it to have the same amount of value as when I get the physical product manufactured? And, a lot of times they're not comfortable with that piece, right? So there are all these different things that I think when you get down to tactically working with brands, to finding like, okay, what are the edges of what you actually want to do? And then how do we work our way backwards, either to like build a slice of what the thing could be, or, inject a little bit of that overarching philosophy into this quarterly release or marketing campaign and see what the traction looks like so you can build on it in the next campaign and things like that.
That's cool. Super cool. And I love that you mentioned context, because that also changes according to the culture, right? Mm-hmm, so mm-hmm. That's not just a definition. Wherever you go, the context changes.
100%.
Yeah. Yeah. That's exciting. Consumers currently, users, there's fear of AI, there's fear of their data being stolen. There's even people that aren't content creators are worried that if they do something in chat, they're going to see it a year later, or things like that. Yeah. Where do you think we can win in that situation? Do you think that there's going to be an evolution of tech that protects that? Or do you think we're always going to be trying to play catch up as people are just rushing out of the gates building?
It's a good question.
And you could be pessimistic too. I'm looking for like real answers.
Yeah. I mean, I think startups are playing a game where they have to move super fast. They're constantly being evaluated on like the latest thing. They're being compared to like, they have to both have this overall vision for their product, but then also be like pivoting as they see what comes out in terms of changes in the marketplace, changes in the in academia, new research that's coming out, especially like in AI, there's always new research coming out. And it's like, wait, I was pursuing this approach and now it's outdated already. How much do I need to pivot? Seeing that side of things, obviously, I understand where that need to move quickly comes from, right? That move fast and break things kind of approach.
Yes.
At the same time, I think I obviously coming from more of a design kind of background, I'm really try to advocate for like being more intentional in the choices we make, right? And some of it is like really simple things of when we think about the history of how technology developed and how we think about things that become commonplace now around our even like digital etiquette, right? Around like what is CCing versus BCCing? What does a hashtag mean? What does it mean to @ someone, right? All of these things, like, it's not like someone sat down and was like, this is going to be the rules of digital communication.
Yes. Super organic.
It's super organic. It came down, I was having this conversation with someone like a couple of days ago. It came down probably to like a sprint. Like, you know, they're planning out the product sprint of like, what can we do this thing? Our users are saying that they want this. What is the way that we can do it? What can we build and execute on within this like next 2 sprints within this next month or whatever, and push it out to respond to this need? So you're kind of thinking on the fly, right? And so my hope is that within those conversations, we're able to, at least with the startups we're working with, bring in enough intentionality to that to be like, okay, let's think through the implications of what you're doing here. But not every startup is going to do that, which is unfortunate. So you can't always do that at the startup level. Some of it you have to change at the policy level. I think our government historically has been a little slow in creating policy around emerging technologies. I think in some ways in Europe, there's better data policies that that have certain regulations around how personal data is used and things like that. I would hope to see some more of those policies enacted in the United States, but obviously, you know, different countries, you have different kind of ways of thinking about data and security and things like that. And then another challenge is just also, I talked a little bit about startups, but startups are funded by, you know, a venture capital kind of system that prioritizes, you know, scale and growth. So I think figuring out what that looks like and what success looks like, and in some ways, like new business models that aren't solely relying on data as being the piece of value that's being extracted and sold is going to be important. And some of that's, you know, changing the public consciousness, right? So there are all these pieces. There's like the startup piece, there's the policy piece, there's kind of the VC piece and its incentive structure. But it also comes back down to, I think, as a broader culture, when we're thinking about data, when we're thinking about content, we've become kind of habituated to content being free, especially in the context of internet. And so if something is free, there's an implicit trade-off, and the trade-off is usually your data. So figuring out, okay, what does that trade-off look like? Am I willing to pay for certain things if I don't want my data to be shared? Or what are basically the new ways of creating value that aren't data-centric? Because unfortunately, that's now how it's predominantly focused.
You know, we have the Meta goggles, we have the Apple goggles. I'm sure there's plenty of R&D happening with all the big players with big pockets, because this is all happening. You know, I haven't tried on the Meta version, but I went to Apple Store and I put on their goggles, and, you know, some of it was just kind of cool and some of it was kind of like, wow. And, but definitely saw the potential. I could definitely see where it's going. And it made me think about, it's just not what the user's seeing, but it's also how content creators have to reimagine how they're going to build story.
Yep.
So that, you know, the person sitting in the chair with these things on are seeing something completely different. So when you think about writers, even filmmakers, you know, color grading, all of these things, you know, that it's going to sort of have this trickle down. Where are you seeing this world going as it's coming? Because, you know, it was funny to watch like the Apple thing come out and so many people blasted it. It's too heavy. All of those things are true, but I could definitely see where they were going with this, you know, lighter, more functional, sound better, all of it.
I'm curious to see how the industry evolves. I think one thing that was interesting about Apple's release specifically is if you look at kind of target markets and positioning of Apple versus Meta, for instance, Meta's Quest headsets are very focused around family, around like you can have narrative experiences. You can play Beat Saber and games with your family, or you can do exercise, right? But a lot of it is around you being in a virtual world and having a virtual identity versus, you know, Vision Pro's kind of positioning is this is a professional device. You know, it's you have your spatial persona that you have that records your actual face, and it's not like a virtual avatar. And then you're having these, you know, because it's more presence related, it's trying to see how can you feel co-present with someone in a real physical space and take into account that spatial context and all of that. So I think it's interesting to see kind of these two kind of tracks around this content developing. You know, on a creative standpoint, on a like design standpoint, I think both of those are really fascinating. I think they're super interesting things to kind of create for. I think that's where the tooling is going to come in though, because to your point and to some of the stuff we talked about before, these are new categories of experiences. They have their own vocabulary and what it means to create them. They have their own kind of way of like telling a story through it. They have their own way of what it means to have a satisfying experience for the viewer, the participant, all of those kind of things. So I think that's where a lot of what I'm interested in over the next couple of years of what we're building with Fabric kind of hones in on is, okay, if we want these new categories of experiences, on the one hand, obviously there's an educational aspect, right? How are we training people to create these new types of experiences? How are we building our scholarship around the like dictionary of storytelling, right? Like we have with film and TV, we've done it for so long that, you know, we have the 180 rule. We have these different rules of like how we frame a shot. And I think some of that has developed over time in VR. Like definitely I've seen when I started working in VR, there was just a lot of like lack of understanding of how we think about perspective and like POV and all of that. And, you know, thankfully a lot of the lectures I used to give in that world, I don't need to do anymore because there's at least some baseline understanding of how we tell a story. But there's more to do there, right? And then there are more like micro formats, even between VR to AR to mixed reality, that have their own variations of these rules. So I think, yeah, there's the educational piece of like understanding how to do that and doing research and pushing the bounds of like how to do that. That's changing. But then the other piece is the tooling of like, we don't have all the tooling we need to kind of create what makes those experiences captivating or fascinating. And I think those tools are happening, like they're being built now. But that's why I've been in this space. I really want to make sure we're shaping those tools in a way that has that vision towards where we want those new formats to go and can help the creators that'll be working there.
Yeah, that's incredible. And, you know, also, I can see this touching every industry, education, travel, medicine, you know, so many applications that this could work in, you know. I can imagine you're having those conversations as well.
Yeah, like when we work with our startups, obviously, Fabric is a bit more focused on a media and entertainment space, but the startups are developing tooling around like 3D workflows, right? We have a company called ModTech that's thinking about how you can take a 3D asset and create different variations of it for different formats of like, oh, you need different kind of polygon count or LOD for if it's in VR versus if it's used for VFX. And so they're working on automating that process. Or we have another startup that's building like a game and rendering engine that enables collaboration between the browser and the headset. Those are all companies that have obviously like a media and entertainment application, but so useful across industries if you're thinking about urban design and digital twins, if you're talking about architecture and construction, if you're talking about like safety and like fire management, or like, I don't know, so many different contexts. There's training, like you said, education, that those types of tool sets are applicable across, especially as you look ahead to being like, oh, there's going to be more spatial computing, there's going to be more edge computing. Those are all going to be important for across verticals.
Generally, there does not seem to be, you know, with the average consumer, a lot of talk, you know, people are not discussing the metaverse that much, you know, NFTs are being celebrated as a failure for a lot of people, you know what I mean? And yet you and I know that as we talk to people, we talk to builders, this technology is very active. It's still being built. You know, in part of me feels like in some ways that the quiet conversation around these things is good because it allows it to come back in more of a functional way. Do you have any thoughts on that about where it stands now and what sort of the public thinks of it at this point?
Yeah, I mean, I think any technology that kind of goes through that hype cycle, like it's a good thing in terms of attention, but usually a bad thing because the technology isn't far enough along to actually deliver on all its promises, right? So with something like the metaverse, which everything started being called a metaverse thing, even if it was or not, the thing that would have made it really able to deliver on its promise was better interoperability, more like data continuity of, oh, I have this experience that starts here, and then I go here, and then I go here, and the world has changed in how it responds to me based on if I met a actor in the theme park, and now I'm going and having a conversation with the virtual version of that character online in the metaverse. They remember that I told them that I like sprinkles on ice cream, or whatever else. Or if I gain the sword of power, or let's say the shoes of power, when I go to this the in-store experience of this footwear brand, then when I'm checking out online, when I'm actually buying the shoes later, it remembers that and gives me the shoes of power discount. I don't know, whatever that looks like, right? Like that's kind of part of that promise of interconnectivity that was part of the metaverse. The tech wasn't fully there to enable that and to enable that type of seamless connectivity and continuity. So I think that's why people who were promised this version of it were disappointed. It's like, oh, it's here, we're getting there. So I think the quietness is good to kind of like develop these tools, get us to the point where we're actually able to have that new category of experiences. But it's going to happen to like every technology that's hyped, right? Like even with AI, like people who know this kind of one version, high level view of AI, and who only really found out about AI when generative AI kind of started popping off more in like November 2022, they are all gung-ho of like generative AI is going to limitlessly scale if we just put more compute behind it, and we're going to be able to click a button and generate a whole movie. And then, those of us who know a level deeper are like, not really. There are a lot of roadblocks to something like that. And it doesn't really make sense in any way, on like a technical way, on a product way, on like so many other kind of categorizations of how you think about it. So I think it's going to hit its own moment where those people who have invested in that vision of the one-click movie are disappointed in the output, right? Like I think even with something like Sora, obviously that we're getting some really interesting results. And I think it will be used in some production-ready applications, but it still needs to be cleaned up a lot. What we're seeing is like a very curated version of, lots of renders done to get what you want. So I think when people realize that the path isn't as like 0 to 100 as they would like, there's also going to be a little bit of disillusionment in this space, which again, I think is not good when we think about like funding and money, unfortunately, but is good in terms of giving the industry space to grow and evolve into being more grounded on the tech side and having that kind of infrastructure that it needs.
In the direction they're going, are there notable tech things that are happening? Like the other day, somebody was telling me about quantum computing, how as that comes of age, maybe a giant gear shift that affects everything above it.
Yeah.
Are you seeing things like that where we see potential big shifts?
Yeah, I mean, I think quantum computing, it's hard to put a timeline on. I think I think there have been a number of attempts to be like, oh, by this year we'll be doing it. By this year we'll be doing it. So I'm not as well versed in that space to be like, for sure, when we're talking 5 years from now, it's going to be a thing. But I think there are interesting things that are happening. I think in the model side with AI, I'm hoping that we move more towards a hybrid view of using these tools. Like in the 90s, there was this view of like, yes, let's use these generative methods, these bottom-up neural network, self-trained kind of methods, but let's also have them intersect with more symbolic top-down systems that humans are creating and curating and designing. And, we kind of moved away from that in order to lean into the scale of what generative AI could do. And my hope is that we kind of move more back towards the hybrid piece so that we have some control over it. Like I think people are trying to get at that with doing things like RAG, if you've heard of that on the AI side, retrieval augmented generation. It's something that's, a subcategory of generative models so that you can reference against existing data sets, so there's less like hallucinations. But
wow,
those results kind of leveled out, didn't quite get where we wanted to go. So I think at some point we're going to have to move towards more of this hybrid view of AI. That's one thing I'm hoping is on the horizon. The kind of like tactility and like tangibility of something that is more operational is where we're going to see these models moving towards. We have these huge LLMs, and I think that's interesting. But in terms of compute and efficiency for applications, isn't fully there. So I think we're going to see more attempts at creating like smaller models that are more targeted, that people can train on their own to reflect who they are. And then when we start to see how this intersects with, I mentioned a couple of times, like edge computing and spatial computing. If you think about edge computing, that's computing that happens on local devices. Right now, our LLMs are predominantly like cloud-based, right? So if we're creating these smaller, more nimble models, they might be able to run fully on device and give us more of that quick feedback loop for new categories of like experiences, which would be more integrated with our day-to-day. So I think that's all really interesting things as we look ahead for what's next.
That's incredible. One of the other things, I don't know if you have an opinion about this, but this has been happening since, the rise of Bitcoin, people talking about the power usage, and that conversation seems to have gotten quieter. And now I'm starting to hear about the data usage and what it takes to AI. I watched a panel a few weeks ago, and the person was like, I don't want to hear about this anymore. It's like, how much energy has the Taylor Swift World Tour used? You know what I mean? Are we sort of picking and choosing what we want to be mad at, or is this actual reality? Even without the public saying anything, I would imagine there's a desire to make this more and more efficient. Nobody wants to just, consume a bunch of energy.
Yeah. I mean, I think it artificially seems like less of an issue now, because companies that want generative models, want LLMs, want these different things to succeed, are bearing the brunt of like compute and energy costs behind, running these models. But once we start actually putting actual numbers behind this of like what it takes to run these systems, the cost for users is going to like scale upwards in a way that people who, right now I'm able to jump onto ChatGPT when I'm sending an email and like quickly send something. But if I really want to be integrated and the costs are to scale with how much they actually cost, that might be prohibitive. So I think there'll be that incentive structure pushing for more efficiency. I think also just on like a hardware level, looking at the bottleneck we have around like GPUs and kind of NVIDIA being the main kind of player in that space, and us not having enough, and that being kind of maybe a bottleneck, might also push people towards more efficiency. But I think there are going to be multiple drivers. So I'm hoping that those all push us towards having a more environmentally responsive version of AI in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I think everybody wants that, right?
Yeah.
Tell me about your experience with ETC.
Yeah, I love ETC. I've worked with most of the departments at ETC in some capacity or the other. Phil, with his interactive and immersive kind of work, done some stuff with him on, I think we've participated when I was actually at the Brand Innovation Studio on some of the events they did, and speaking about how we're seeing, it was actually, I think, about how the ideas of the metaverse were intersecting with new production modalities and things like that. Had the chance to work on world building with Eric Weaver and his team for some of their shorts, like Ripple Effect and Fathead, which have been really cool.
Fathead is an incredible movie.
Yes, C. Craig as a director is great. And we got to have a bunch of like world building conversations on what are the rules of how the junkyard works and how does it look and all of those, which are great. And I really love what Eric's doing in that space of like always experimenting with new like edge cases with virtual production. Even on the AI side, we've collaborated. We've done before some projects around, he has a tool that's able to really look at the big data piece of social engagement and understand, clusters of fans and see what they get excited about, which has been great for brands or IP brands to see around, okay, I didn't realize I had this whole segment of this type of fan that are really passionate about and sharing about me all the time. How do I reach out to them? What are the things they care about? How can I make sure I'm including them in the story of what I'm saying I do? So yeah, and then with George and the character work that he's doing, we went to CES together last year, and we're looking at kind of new and emerging tech. So I've had the chance to work with kind of all the different pieces of ETC, and they're great, and I love what they're exploring.
Yeah, that's incredible. Yeah, I pay attention to what they're doing and try to go to everything that they sponsor too, because it's, it's always a great learning experience.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add? Is there anything you want to talk about?
No, I think you asked some great questions. I really loved how we covered the intersection of like AI and experience. I think for me, that's something I'm really passionate about. I think a lot of the reason that I moved into spending so much time with the tooling is seeing the gaps of, as a creator, I want to create these types of experiences and I can't. Okay, how do I make the tools that let me do that? I'm really excited to see how the space develops. I'm glad that you're kind of a voice in this space to, look at who is making what, and that making sure we're developing in a way that's building towards something interesting. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I love it. I was really excited to have you on, and, I've been doing this for a little bit, but the thread that I'm finding, which is really encouraging, is no matter how advanced the tech get, we still have to have good story. Mm-hmm. Like, these are new containers for good story. And I think the fear is from a lot of content creators that, they're going to get easily replaced. But the truth is that I feel like they still have to be good experiences. Yeah. And that doesn't happen through the tech, that happens through people. So, with what you're doing, with what I'm seeing ETC doing, virtual production walls, things like that, these are all great tools. And I hope that content creators feel like they still have a strong influence in terms of how good of an experience this ultimately all is. Yes. I mean, I think at the end of the day, everything is story. That's what appeals to people. That's what keeps people coming back. So as much as I'm passionate about the tools, I do think that, I love to talk about the story. I love to make sure that we're all having intelligent conversations about how we can understand what story means in this new age. Excellent. Excellent. Rachel, thank you so much for your time today. I really, really appreciate it. This was really great for me. And I look forward to watching more of what you guys do. And so, yeah, I'm just super grateful for your time. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.